Hi, everybody. We're about to get started. Sorry that we're a little bit late. It's really exciting to see you all here today. My name is Katie Schools. I'm with the Scontress Labor Center. I'm the community outreach organizer. And before we get started, I just wanted to acknowledge our co-sponsors for today's event. We have a lot of really great ones. The Wabanaki Alliance, the Maine Labor Climate Council, the A. Philip Randolph Institute Maine chapter, the University of Southern Maine Office of Equity, Inclusion, and Community Impact, and the USM Office of Intercultural Student Affairs. And just quickly before we start, one of our co-sponsors, the A. Philip Randolph Institute Maine chapter, just has an announcement about an event that's taking place after this one. So I'm just going to invite Cynthia Finney up to do that.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here to learn what we're going to get to learn at this talk. And our A. Philip Randolph Institute, which is our Union Members of Color constituency group in the state of Maine, is also co-sponsoring just down the street at Hannaford, a rally to urge Hannaford to sign up with Milk with Dignity, which will be a program to protect farm workers primarily, but we'll also support the farms. So any of you who want to join us down at Hannaford after, would love to have you.
All right, so I would like to introduce our speaker today, Professor David Shane Lowry. Professor Lowry is an anthropologist, enrolled member of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina, assistant professor of anthropology and Native American studies at the University of Southern Maine, and the son of a UAW member. David grew up in the Lumbee community in Robeson County, North Carolina, after his father retired from the Chrysler Corporation in St. Louis. With degrees from MIT and University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, he has taught at Chicago Medical School, MIT, Biola University, and Brandeis University. David's first book, Lumbee Pipelines, American Indian Movement and the Residue of Settler Colonialism, will be available in August of 2025 with the University of Nebraska Press. So it is customary to begin USM events with a land acknowledgement. However, land acknowledgements do not mean anything without processes to give back land that has been stolen. So the Scontress Center, with the help of David's input, would like to make this statement instead, which is an edited version of the USM statement. The University of Southern Maine campuses occupy lands belonging to the Abenaki and Wabanaki people. In addition to the Abenaki, the broader place we now call Maine is home to the sovereign people of the Wabanaki Confederacy, the Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Maliseet, and Micmac people. We exist and profit on their unceded homelands, and this land should be returned. David's presence here today as an Indian scholar who focuses on the remattering of American Indian people is part of our attempt to have an embodiment of a land acknowledgement that exists in practice rather than words. So with that, if we could all welcome David.
And also, any student who just came in, the attendance book is up here. If you want to get it now or later, it doesn't matter. And for those of you who need to leave at 6:15 in my last class, you can, but I invite you to stay, so it doesn't matter. What you choose to do. Thank you all for having me. And I'll get started because I have a lot to say, as my students know. So here we go. See if that works. Here we go. All right. So the United States is not the United States. Surprise, surprise. It is stolen American Indian, stolen indigenous land. The U.S. Constitution is not American, which is interesting because all laws, everything is based on that concept, right? It's actually Haudenosaunee, or I think in particular Mohawk law. It was the Great Law of Peace that Haudenosaunee people have written. And it came about because George Washington, the guy that's on the border, and other white colonial serial. What is that? Great Law of Peace. That would make for a great government infrastructure. And I probably need to stay in front of the microphone, don't I, for the recording. So became America. Everything that you see and hear and taste, from music to food to politics, is American Indian, Native American, Indigenous. And I use those terms interchangeably, and that's a whole conversation. But if you hear American Indian, equate it with Native American and Indigenous, unless I state otherwise. But the great deception of America, what no one wants to talk about, is how important American Indian people have been, and are to making America as powerful and influential as it is. I lecture on these topics a lot, but today I want to focus on the idea of labor unionization or labor organizing as a space and set of relationships that have long included American Indian, Native American, Indigenous peoples, with a particular emphasis on how we must see, acknowledge, and recognize the sovereign authorities of American Indian peoples and other Indigenous peoples that fall underneath, for whether they want to or not, underneath the umbrella of what we call the United States. And Canada also in some respects. I was hit in the face with this conversation back in 2022, maybe around springtime, Marchish, maybe, when I was gathering data related to American Indian and other Indigenous presence and erasure on the campus of Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT. I attempted to enter a building called Walker Memorial, which this is Walker Memorial behind me in this photograph. It is one of the oldest buildings on MIT's campus, and when I was a student at MIT in the late 90s, early 2000s, it was a major site of eating and socialization within the MIT student community. However, since the early 1900s, it was a memorial, a celebration of the role of science and technology in suppressing Indigenous worlds for the sake of settling the continent, or more precisely, positioning the United States as a platform for technological and engineering dominance. Well, as I entered the building that day, really gung ho in my project, I was very focused. I was stopped by a white lady with a clipboard. Reminded me of like one of my elementary school teachers. I was a bit shocked. MIT people typically don't do that in this community. They don't stop people as they're trying to access buildings when they obviously have permission to be in there via card access, for example. And I asked her, "What? Why? I have work that I'm doing." She spoke sternly, but kind of peacefully, with a sense of dominance, if that makes sense. "We are casting a union vote," she said. "Per law, this space where the voting is taking place is off limits." So this was an interesting moment. This was an interesting moment in MIT history. Graduate students were positioning themselves within a potential union to protect themselves, to provide themselves with health care and better wages as graduate students. This was against an MIT administration who, without doubt, abused them. Rumors swirled around the time of this vote and ahead of this vote that MIT administrators posted notices across the campus that attempted to bust up the union, to make students feel intimidated as they went in to vote. This day was the day of significance, however, and the vote had to be protected. And I, as a non-union sort of person, was not allowed into the space. However, I couldn't help but think about my work at MIT that year. That building, the Walker Memorial Building, was a celebration of MIT's third president, Francis Amasa Walker, who almost single-handedly designed and implemented the reservation system for American Indians across the United States. He, Francis Walker, turned MIT's schools and departments after he became president into training grounds for all sorts of genocidal work under the cover of science and technology. I was in that moment working to convince MIT to understand and respond to its role, its institutional role in the erasure of American Indian peoples, knowledges, authorities within MIT itself and within what we would see as the science and technology landscape that defines the United States and now increasingly the world. I was working to help MIT understand that American Indian people from hundreds of tribal nations have been and continue to be students at MIT. I was working to help MIT understand how it had overtly and covertly kept American Indian people who grew up in tribal communities from across what we call Turtle Island, which is this continent because it looks like a turtle, from working in permanent tenurable faculty positions at MIT and other equally powerful universities. What this is a question, what was this crafting of humanity, this building of the union, right? Within a building that celebrates to this day the de-unionization of American Indian peoples through science and technology. Well, to begin to understand how we might answer that question, I want to begin here in Maine. And if you heard my recent podcast called They're Eating the Dogs, I actually talked about this a little bit. Maine represents itself as a place of humanity, even for non-human relatives. A report from February of 2024 states that Maine ranks second best state for animal protection laws. At the same time, it can be argued that Maine ranks first and the suppression of American Indian peoples and sovereignties. In particular, the sovereignties and authorities and the presences of the 5 Wabanaki tribal nations. This has shown up in various states of legal and political altercation, such as the lawsuit by the Penobscot Nation, which is shown here down at the bottom right-hand corner, against the state of Maine for rights to protect the Penobscot River. Any of you grow up near the Penobscot River? No one at all? Yeah, one, okay, interesting. Which the Supreme Court at that time voted against. They voted against the Penobscot people to protect their rights to kind of commandeer and engineer and protect and steward the Penobscot River. Oftentimes, American Indians are allowed to be present, but only to entertain and provide companionship to non-Indian people. Indeed, when it comes down to it, non-Indian people, white people, black people, even people from across the world, show Indian folks, Native folks, Indigenous folks, that we haven't made it to their level of humanity and advocacy. Now, in that context, consider the Democrat National Convention. I was eating popcorn for both the RNC and the DNC, so I really wanted to see what happened, right? So consider the DNC, Democrat National Convention. Deb Haaland, who's American Indian, who was the Secretary of the Interior, the first Native to lead the Interior ever, was allowed to speak for 3 minutes and 20 seconds. And here I showed timestamps on Google just so you can see that. I don't show this, but Peggy Flanagan, Lieutenant Governor of Minnesota, who is also American Indian, was allowed to speak for 3 minutes and 30 seconds. Combined, their time on stage did not match the time that UAW on United Auto Workers Representative Shawn Fain had on stage, which was over 9 minutes. So 3.5 plus 3.5 equals 7, doesn't quite match the 9. Meanwhile, we can't let the RNC go. Meanwhile, over at the Republican National Convention, my cousin, literally my cousin, Jared Lowry, read the Pledge of Allegiance, which lasted probably 30 seconds, a minute maybe, while the Teamsters representative, Sean O'Brien, had a whopping 17 minutes on stage. The DNC caught my attention because my dad, and I actually made this collage, my dad passed away in 2018. Everywhere I go, people are like, "Oh, you look like Clarence." I'm like, "Really? Okay, cool." I didn't realize it when I was young. Apparently I do. The DNC caught my attention because my dad was a loyal UAW member, and he actually didn't teach me how to wear bow ties. I learned later on, but I appreciate the fact that I picked it up. But not without critique, right? He was a UAW member, but not without critique. He didn't fully trust the UAW, but he understood the importance of organized labor. When he tried to convince the people from our community, the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina, to organize the local Converse and DuPont corporate workplaces for their health and well-being, other Lumbee people shook their heads. They were afraid of the word union. Their organization, one Lumbee community member reminded my dad at church, is in the Lumbee tribe. He said no other organization is needed in this community. My dad didn't agree with his concern, though, and he thought he was kind of like, flubbing. Many Lumbee people were interlinked with unions, even in southeastern North Carolina. For example, Leroy Freeman, who became famous for his designing mail bags that are still used by the U.S. Mail Service or Postal Service today, is Lumbee, and he was part of the American Postal Workers Union at that time. But this was a critical moment in Lumbee tribal history. Lumbee people who rejected unions had a point. They had a good point. The Lumbee tribe was being newly organized by people like my father-in-law, which is my wife's father, who were in the midst of writing tribal constitution and preparing the tribal constitution of the Lumbee tribe and preparing for the tribe's first governmental election. That was roughly around 1993, I believe. Lumbee people were fighting for themselves or ourselves, for our senses of collectivity. And the idea of organizing around labor that was starting to disappear in the age of the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, was really odd to Lumbee people. They only had so much time to work on social and political gathering. And the notion of forming or supporting labor unions seemed to put a target on their Lumbee backs. So my question at this point is, why would he have said these things? This person at church, why would he have said that to my dad? We don't care to organize. How do we begin to understand the space of labor organization or unionization as a political, social, and economic dimension that ought to serve as the starting point for much needed conversations about the United States and Canada also as stolen American Indian land and indigenous land that ought to be returned? At this point, I want to thank Matthew Emick, the director of the Conscious Labor and Community Education Center at the University of Southern Maine. Several months ago, back in the previous academic year, we connected through Lydia Savage, who's the chair of geography and anthropology, or she was at that time, to discuss possible collaborations as we build Native American and Indigenous studies here at University of Southern Maine. When Matthew and I met, he quickly introduced me to his work in North Carolina around the cucumber and pickle economy. My eyes lit up because one of my summer jobs a few decades ago was to harvest cucumbers and take them to a processor who would ultimately deliver them to Mount Olive pickles, the little green jar in the grocery store, the pickles, the relish, great stuff. I still eat it today. Matthew, I believe, knew Lumbee people, but he confessed or acknowledged that he didn't know Lumbee people that well. He didn't know fully how to integrate the work of union and labor advocacy with the sovereignties and needs and desires of American Indian, Native American tribal nations. Well, I told Matthew that the ironic part of all of this was that many Lumbee people, indeed many American Indian and other indigenous peoples in the United States and Canada, are part of unions. As a 7 or 8-year-old, I would tag along with my father, this guy right here on the left, to meetings of the UAW group for Chrysler in St. Louis, Missouri. During the work week, many of the members, it seemed, would meet at White Castle. It was their place to think and talk, which White Castle is not as good as it used to be, but still, it was a great place. However, my father, Clarence, his name was Clarence Rabin Lowry, talked about how he and other American Indian and many Lumbee people would talk about amongst themselves about what they were going to do to support and sort of protect their ways and their lives and their livelihoods in Chrysler. They sensed particular tensions in their social and political life within what Chrysler called plants. That was the name of the manufacturing space. On one hand, American Indian people were happy to have a corporation invest in them as they left their tribal homelands and attempted to acquire fair paying work. I remember looking through shoe boxes at black and white photos of my father, similar sort of to this, from 1959 as he wore a James Dean-esque jacket, hair slicked back, talking to his supervisors. Everybody was smoking at that time. They admitted to my father that American Indians were powerful and influential simply because they had engineering and organizational skills that were not matched in white or black communities. And at that time, there weren't many Latino, Hispanic folks in the United States, at least not in the Missouri area. We don't lay up from work, my uncle Cecil, my dad's brother, used to tell me. We are on time. The we that he referenced were American Indian people. People from the Lumbee tribe, the Mohawk tribe, Winnebago, Potawatomi, Cherokee, and Osage, and others. I remember my father having conversations with my mom saying, yeah, he has to be Indian, talking about one of his coworkers. Or a new woman began to work with us. She said she drives back to the reservation every weekend after work. On the other hand, American Indian workers were always dealing with the precarity, the uneasiness of life at Chrysler. The American Indian presence was so thick in that plant that Lee Iacocca, who practically invented, I think he did invent the Ford Mustang and made Chrysler a major manufacturing competitor in the 1980s, entered plant number 2 in St. Louis, where my dad worked, and asked one of the plant administrators, quote, "Is this becoming a reservation or what? What am I seeing?" What he meant was, wow, what are all these Indians doing here? And how are you going to handle this? Has anybody been to St. Louis? The Gateway Arch, before it was finished. After the Gateway Arch was finished by Mohawk iron workers in 1963, that is after several people, this was after several people died trying to connect the two sides of the arch. Necessitating the skill and fearlessness of Mohawk ironworkers. Some Mohawk people, again, they're from New York and Canada, stayed in St. Louis to utilize their skills in the putting together of metal automobiles at Chrysler and I think also at Ford. Their stories also included a widespread unwillingness to understand what they, Indian laborers in the car industry, represented Indian laborers at Chrysler and other auto manufacturers, represented dozens of the over 600 American Indian nations in the United States. There were many times that my father had to beat the living daylights, and I should use another word, but I'll use that word, out of a white worker for mocking another Indian person. And my mom said he used to fight a lot, and it was weird. And I'm hearing this, I'm like, people didn't have like HR and stuff, and my mom was like, nah, they handled stuff back then. But he had to defend other Indian people against white people. At the same time, he was a political agent, making sure that processes that were set up to support and humanize all workers also worked for Indian laborers. Within these attempts to make sure American Indian people were included, my father had to convince other Indian people to make sure American Indian people were included. I'm sorry. My father had to convince other Indian people to support the UAW to make sure Indian people were included. That is, he had to convince them that instead of developing a collective voice as indigenous native peoples against the colony or colonial space that they worked in, they, American Indians, had to see unions as a middle ground for fair pay, stability, and fairness or health within their workspace. All of this was happening. Oh, and also this is a picture of Mohawk iron workers at the bottom here who worked after 9/11, kind of dismantling the World Trade Centers in New York. All of this was happening in the mid to late 20th century. If you aren't familiar with this period in US history, it was the time of Indian termination and relocation. Indian termination was a policy within which the US federal government attempted through policy action and inaction to undermine the sovereign authorities of American Indian tribal nations. Part of this undermining included work to remove capitalistic opportunities in and around Indian communities. The end result, in the minds of US politicians and bureaucrats, was that Indians would be mixed into the melting pot bowl. Ben Nighthorse Campbell, who is Northern Cheyenne, I think he's still living, and a former US Senator for Colorado, once said of Indian termination and relocation, the aim of this policy was to absorb Indians until they simply disappear into the mainstream culture. In Washington, talking about the capital of the US, in Washington's infinite wisdom, it was decided that tribes should no longer be tribes. Never mind that they had been tribes for thousands of years, unquote. Indian termination beginning in the 1940s continued into the 1950s and 1960s when, in response or as a part of this process, the US federal government enacted what we might label Indian relocation or urban relocation. Having dismembered American Indian nations and making citizens and members individuals who should fight individually to survive, the US government set up agreements with corporate and governmental giants such as Ford, Chrysler, NASA, and Morton Salt in Chicago, which I found that out when I lived in Chicago, to usher American Indians in to fill roles on assembly lines and within the organization of the Apollo missions to outer space and NASA. And actually, this is a photo for like an advertisement. It says, "Come to Denver, the chance of your lifetime." And basically, it'll show you a picture of Indian people, like sort of packed up, ready to go. And then on the side, it'll tell you, "Hey, we're going to train you, give you money, give you food," because the government purposely starved Native people in their lands. And they said, "Hey, you don't want to starve? Go do what we want you to do," which is be kind of sort of underpaid labor in urban cities at that time. But that's where the unions come in. This was a politically contentious time. If you remember history class after Brown versus Board of Education, many American Indians across the United States saw no hope in integrated schools. Indian people were told by each other that new corporate opportunities in bigger cities such as Los Angeles and Boston and Denver and St. Louis and Chicago and Detroit would provide security that they couldn't otherwise get. The federal government, via moguls like Alfred Sloan up here, who created the School of Management at MIT and trained students to, quote, manage all those Indian problems within the United States, reaffirmed these new diasporas of American Indian peoples into urban, corporate, and governmental centers of power and influence. While living in California in 2018, I was with my wife, Nicole. Some of you have met her, at a powwow, the Orange County powwow, which is south of LA. And I met an older Indian man who wore one of those real Air Force or NASA jackets, you know, with all the cool patches. I was super curious about where it came from and why he wore it. As I introduced myself and introduced my role as a nosy Lumbee anthropologist, which I still am today, he looked at me as if a light bulb went off. He said, quote, "You don't see us, do you?" I know my face kind of made a little, "What are you talking about? I don't see you." He said, "Us Indians are everywhere in everything you see. We worked for NASA because they needed us, but we were also in the fields too. They tell you, right, that those Mexicans were picking those crops. Nah, they were probably us. We were," talking about Indian people, "we were everywhere." Unquote. So the work of the US federal government to dismember and dismantle American Indian nations had an interesting effect. As Indians were in every aspect of American society, literally everywhere, intended for disappearance through assimilation, they, Indians were increasingly present and expertly impactful in making America work. They designed the computer programming for space flights and authored by NASA. And this is actually Mary Ross, who's Cherokee, who designed literally half of the programming or a quarter of the programming. It was a large chunk within the Apollo missions in the 1960s. They Indians inspected cars. They designed routes and processes for distributing produce, etc. So here's a question that I want you to sort of linger on, and I'm not really going to answer it, but just linger with it. Like, let it sit on your heart and your mind. What is the role of labor? When we use that term, what is labor? How has labor been used to attempt or to erase and dematter or dematerialize American Indian and other indigenous peoples within the United States? Throughout the 1800s and early 1900s, the U.S. federal government stole or human trafficked American Indian children into boarding schools where the U.S. federal government attempted to, quote, civilize Indian children through labor indoctrination. They would hang signs in these boarding schools that read, quote, labor conquers all things, as you can see up here. The routine of labor, the hum of irons and the melody of bells whipping students who didn't obey, defined life for hundreds and thousands of Indian children across the United States every year between the mid 1800s and some argue the mid 1940s and maybe even to the 1950s. In the process of making Indian children focus on surviving those moments, boarding school organizers attempted to pull them out of relationship with deep time. And we talked about this in my class the other day, deep time in the United States. This involves stripping Indian children of their languages from Cree to Mohawk to Wampanoag to Penobscot to Passamaquoddy. The structures of boarding schools were designed to encode these children with new senses of being in their bodies, with new senses of being in the world. My father told me that when I was about 8 or 9, that many Indian people he worked with did not like school. And I was curious about that. I never understood what he was trying to say. What do you mean you didn't like school? They didn't like school. But he had a reason behind that. This was hard for me to imagine. I love school. It was a place for me to follow in the footsteps of my ancestors and, conquer the world. But I didn't realize that school for many Indian peoples, American Indian peoples, was a place where various actors, from churches to government agents to corporate liaisons, attempted to conquer Indian people through labor routines. This past week, I was lecturing about time in my introductory anthropology course, and I reminded students how construction of today's Israel was and is a direct response to the forced conditions of labor and waiting that Jewish peoples endured in Holocaust camps in Europe, which, not ironically, utilized the same language as the Indian boarding schools in the United States. And this sign above this camp says what? Yeah, labor makes you free, something to that effect. What happened in Holocaust camps and boarding schools, the breaking down of humanity and attempts at full genocidal erasure, shows up across the Western Hemisphere. Take Hawaii, for example. Anybody go to Hawaii for vacation? Don't raise your hands. I don't want to hear about it. They don't want you there. Don't tell me. Don't want you to get caught. Take Hawaii, for example. If you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the states that have the highest rates of union membership are New York, where Mohawk people live largely, and Hawaii. So those are the two most unionized states, New York and Hawaii. In a 2003 article from the American Postal Worker magazine, titled Labor Organizing Changed the Hawaiian Islands Forever, the authors assert this, and just listen to the language. They say, the birth of the Hawaiian labor movement was a painful experience marked by a number of failed job actions on the islands, sugarcane plantations over the course of 50 years. The largely Asian workforce learned bitter lessons from several failed farm worker strikes. Most notably in 1909, 1920, 1924, before the Great Strike of 1946. So I guess that's what unions tend to do from time to time. They tend to stop working and quote unquote strike. That all island work stoppage was a success because workers of all races finally organized into a single labor union. Sounds like a melting pot, right? Once it took root, labor organizing forever changed the Hawaiian Islands, economically, politically, and socially. The article goes on, and you can look this up, but the article goes on and says this: Europeans arrived in Hawaii in 1778, and the first sugarcane plantation was established about 50 years later. Wonder what happened between 1778 and 50 years later? I don't know. Nobody was there? I don't know. By the middle of the 19th century, growers had to import workers to meet production demands. Wow, they had to import people. That's crazy. In 1851, a group of growers formed the Royal Hawaiian Agricultural Society in part to address the, quote, labor problem. The growers pooled their resources to handle an expected influx of immigrants and instituted a contract labor system. Plantation employees committed to working a fixed number of years during which they were paid only subsistence wages, which means low wages. Shortly after the Growers Association was formed, the first imported laborers arrived from China. God, more people coming into Hawaii. That's amazing. I wonder who was there first, but we'll get to that. Before the end of the century, 46,000 Chinese workers had come to Hawaii. Plantation work consisted of 10-hour days, 6-day weeks. Women paid 2/3 of what women were paid 2/3 of what men were paid. Weeded the fields, stripped the cane of dry leaves, or cut the seed cane. So women did all that work. Men handled the quote unquote heavy work, cutting, carrying, loading raw sugar. So the article goes on to describe how sugar oligarchs, the white people who own sugar business in Hawaii, created tension and inequities between workers. Then it says, after Hawaii became a U.S. territory in 1900, I'm still trying to figure out who was there first, contract labor was declared illegal. Interesting. But the growers had built up a large pool of workers. To sow disunity, plantation owners paid different nationalities at different wage rates. Distrust among the groups, each living in segregated plantation camps, was widespread, unquote. Now, as you can probably tell by my sarcasm, while it is charming to think about labor and the organization of labor as central to life in Hawaii and the emergence of Hawaii as a state in what is now the United States, so much was and is missing from the story. What was not discussed in this article was the fact that Hawaii is stolen indigenous land. And a colony is a colony of the United States via the overthrow of the Hawaiian government. The words colony, indigenous, and native are conveniently missing from this script, from this article. Hawaii is Hawaii is imagined as a territory that is born within white sugar capitalists arriving and then subsequently and systematically recruiting people from all the nations, China, Philippines, etc., to Hawaii for work. There is no mention of Native and Indigenous Hawaiians who, within the processes of demanding their land back, and at the time in those 50 years were demanding their land back, made decisions to join organized labor in Hawaii. They lived a double consciousness, right? Their identities as indigenous people, dispossessed of their lands and waters and authorities, were ignored. Meanwhile, they were only seen, it seems, as one of the many ethnic racial groups fighting for fair pay within a colonial plantation system that should not have existed in the first place. So what makes this even more interesting, and I'll sort of move into this, we're in Maine, right? Maine seems to be this kind of off the cuff, sort of casual, like, what do we do in Maine? We go on vacation. What makes this even more interesting is that the overthrow of the indigenous Hawaiian kingdom, an overthrow which preceded these fights for unionization, labor, and fairness in the state of Hawaii, was planned. The overthrow was planned in Maine, in Augusta and Kennebunkport, by John Levitt Stevens, the guy on the left. He worked with Sanford Dole, the namesake of the Dole Corporation, the pineapple you eat at Disney and places like that, whose parents were, am I saying this right, Bowdoin College alum. So while organizations like the United Postal Workers sort of organization see their concern, organized labor, as the beginning of all important conversations about Hawaii, I ask you in this room in Maine to consider why their stories, their ways of seeing the origins of labor and struggles of humanity in relationship to labor, do not begin with stolen indigenous land. Why don't they even mention that the land was stolen, that the kingdom was overthrown? Our conversations about stolen indigenous land and suppression of indigenous governments, the layer of context and history that cause all other conversations about humanity to have to pause. And in my 220 class, I call this the main pause, which there's a pause in colonialism. Everybody wants to sort of rah, rah, help them, blah, blah. But when you talk about indigenous peoples, everybody pauses. There's that layer you just can't metaphysically and intellectually get into. Yes, it's that layer, and it's okay to acknowledge that it exists. You cannot, and this is my kind of like soapbox, you cannot defend laborers. You have no ability to defend the dignity of humans as laborers unless you understand and speak about the origins of the United States and Canada and the rest of the colonial Western Hemisphere and the weaponization of labor. That is a conversation that needs to happen across Native America and Indian country. Interestingly, in the Navajo Nation, which is sort of pictured here, Navajo people actually utilize local organized labor as a protective mechanism that shields them against not the colonial government, but against the ownership of mines by and with the Navajo Nation. Interesting, right? What does it mean that unions on behalf of Native peoples sign contracts or agreements with the millennia old organizations of Indigenous people, which are Indigenous tribal nations themselves, in protection of those peoples? Do unions assume a sovereign space, a space of organizational and political authority that Indigenous people support, utilize, and then place in juxtaposition or maybe in competition to their own tribal governments and peoples? I would say maybe, especially in this case. Again, consider the politics of Maine. A conversation that I have read about recently is the dilemma of new Mainers, new immigrants to Maine who in various ways are becoming the subject of union labor organization. A Maine AFL-CIO article from late 2023 and a discussion of the work of immigrant advocacy and support, which I think is based here in Portland, a labor union organization, summarizes that, quote, new Mainers, unquote, who attended their meeting, quote, already have significant construction experience and are now looking to translate into stable careers in the United States. And they were excited to learn about the benefits of joining a union. And the person speaking, their last name was Boss, B-O-S-S, which I think is an ironic union name. Some of you may know Boss. I ask you in this moment to realize that, like in Hawaii, Maine, even in its union-led humanism, might be and arguably is distracting you from the reality of stolen Indigenous land and suppression of Indigenous nations and voices through the busy politics of newer and newer immigrants. You just bring on waves of immigrants. It distracts you. Here in Maine, we live and work in a state that has 3 layers or slots of what I call slots of citizenship. There's Indigenous peoples, there's the older colonial Mainers, which actually call themselves, I'm a Mainer. Now they say they're Mainers. And then there's the new Mainers. So Indigenous, Mainer, and then new Mainer. These multiple layers of colonial occupation of Maine distract from the original but perpetually suppressed Indigenous Wabanaki owners and sovereigns of what we now call Maine. Look again at the current the current presidential election. Various unions under the AFL-CIO are not sure which president, Trump or Harris, will do the most for unions. Those same unions, as demonstrated by the authoritative presence of the UAW at the DNC and the muted presence of American Indian peoples relative to the UAW, do not seem concerned with the disappearances of American Indian and Indigenous peoples in everyday life and the future of the United States. Like the United States, the notion of unity and union keeps us from discussing the disunity that underlies everything around you, including ongoing threats to the sovereignties and health and peace of the 5 Indigenous nations that make up the Wabanaki Confederacy. In 2022, an article by the AP, the Associated Press, was titled, Maine Governor Signs Bill Letting Tribe Regulate Its Water. Let me remind everybody in this room and everybody listening to this recording that the governor of Maine can only give rights if the state of Maine and the United States and all of its old and new Mainers are suppressing the sovereign, millennia-old rights of Abenaki peoples to protect and engineer their waters and ecologies and their work. In reality, no rights are given to Indigenous peoples. They are only suppressed and dismissed because Indigenous rights in the United States, or what is called now the United States, are inherent. They existed before 1776, before white people came to America, before colonization. You can't do anything with them. They are inherent. They are continual. As wind farm politics steadily take over the life of Maine politics, and you may have not heard this, there's tons of articles about wind farms. Various unions, such as those who represent the lobster trade, juxtapose the concerns of Wabanaki tribal nations. Are they all stakeholders and constituencies? Do they all have do they all have say? So is everybody a constituency in these conversations? Does everybody have a say? To say that they do, that they have equal say in the future on stolen Wabanaki waters and lands, undermines the prioritization of Wabanaki peoples. I often say there's priorities and justice. You can fight for any type of humanity, but in the United States, because it's stolen Indian land, First Nations take priority in everything. Indeed, if you take this article at face value, this one right here, you must question its wording. Janet Mills is not in a position to give Wabanaki Nations a quote seat at the table. The table is already theirs. The table belongs to Wabanaki Nations. The table is stolen Indigenous wood. Are unions Indigenous? And I'll end with this. Are unions Indigenous? Only if they protect and revolve around the lives and sovereignties of Indigenous peoples. Otherwise, they are a colonial distraction that must be dismantled and replaced. Thank you. Appreciate it. Now, did you want to entertain some questions? Feel free to ask me anything.
All right, the end of it, you said to replace that type of union system.
Mhm.
Do you have any ideas how we could make that a better system and a more inclusive one?
Labor organization, and this is me thinking out loud because this is a fairly new conversation with me, and I sort of have developed it this year. Union organization is really about the body, the protection of the body, the protection of time, right? The protection of community. And I feel like those are organic Indigenous values. The irony of all of this whole story, is that when George Washington stole the Haudenosaunee, the Mohawk in particular, Great Love Piece, the only part that he didn't steal was the rule within the Mohawk community that women get to veto everything, right? And so I think women are still getting paid less than men, even with unions sort of doing what they do. And so I feel like there needs to be this reprioritization of sort of the ethics of everyday life and labor in the body and sort of how people just exist, right? How they maintain their safety. This gets into police unions, educational unions, etc. Through the context of the tribal nations, there's 600 of us throughout the United States. Now, I will say this. I think it's funny that Deb Haaland is the Department of Interior Secretary. Like, they'll make Indians in charge of like the buffalo horses and Indians, but they will never put us in charge of education. One of the major problems, and I don't know if you've seen this film, Waiting for Superman, it's about basically teacher unions in large part around the United States who just don't help education at all. If you would put American Indian people, if you put American Indian people in charge of education, like the Department of Education, there's this restabilization of how things are talked about, pedagogy, how things are taught. And so to answer your question, what is the replacement? Is really centering all of these efforts, these moral efforts, these kind of political efforts to protect the human sort of life and body and existence through these nations that have been systematically suppressed. So it's really going to take what is the US government and different organizations within the US going to tribal nations and saying, what should I do? Now, I think the Navajo community is a good representation of what may be the future. It's literally Navajo people sitting there saying, I need my tribal nation to be who they are, but I also need this other unionized apparatus to protect my dignity, my health, my well-being. And I would argue that the Navajo blueprint, if you will, is probably the way forward. What is this contractual sort of continual conversation between the Navajo Union or whatever that local union is the Navajo people are part of and the Navajo government that makes it work? And I think it actually does fairly well. Yeah. Does anybody in the room know more about them? I'm just learning about them. Anybody know what, like, okay. I think it's a fascinating story. And it's basically a union of people who work in the mines on the Navajo reservation. Yeah. Any other questions?
Can I ask you one?
Yeah, please.
USM does have multiple unions, and I guess
Mhm.
thinking about your own status at the university, what is your relationship to the your union or the union that could potentially represent you?
I got scolded in my email by somebody, I won't say who it is, but you might know who it is, who said, why aren't you part of the union?
Yeah,
was
I
like,
may or may not be trying
Yeah.
to ask you why.
Um, in my community, people are part of the church too. And they say, well, we don't pay tithes to a church for so much time. Like, you know, they might go to the church a year or two. And that's a very kind of Christian sort of reality. But I think that unions are sort of like tithing. It's sort of like you're in a community and you have to really become part of the community before you invest in that next layer of community. So, but I will say this, I'm the first tenure track American Indian faculty member at USM. So before me, the unions here existed without people like me. So what does that tell you? For decades. So what does that tell you? I'll just leave it at that.
All right, we got a few more minutes.
I'd love to hear from some of the people who are like not my students, but like guests who are here hearing this, maybe from the work union world. Do you have any questions? Do you want to like, is there anything that popped in your mind that is of concern or? Please, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I work up in Augusta at the state capitol, so I'm been involved with a lot of the stuff you mentioned and just some, I don't want to sort of kind of just inject myself or anything,
Mhm.
but if you don't mind, I just wanted to give a few perspectives from my vantage point is that, so yeah, basically it became very contentious when it came to offshore wind because the people that usually support tribal sovereignty, self-determination, as well as supporting organized labor in general, that worldview, they kind of were really split because people thought, there was people that wanted a transition away from, fossil fuel and newer alternatives to mitigate climate. But then at the same time, the process and the exclusion of the tribes in some of the conversations and where they were going to launch some of these offshore winds on tribal land, that really pitted supporters of both unions and tribes. And to the point where unions were not very happy because a lot of their supporters actually on the first round of voting killed an offshore wind proposal this past year. But having that being said, then supporters of offshore wind and those closest to those who kind of went away from labor that usually went with them, there was a ferocious behind the scenes movement. And then when it came down to it, it's like, are you going to support kind of the established sort of well-known leaders and powerful people? Or are you going to support the tribes? The tribes didn't, so in theory, people say, yeah, we support tribal sovereignty, but when it comes down to it, it's very hard to kind of get there, when people have to make a decision. So.
Yeah. I guess in general in the United States, we're split. I think the Teamsters being at one convention and that UAW being in another really shows you that these issues are not as kind of clear as they used to be. Even to the point where I think a lot of Native people, and I've talked to people around different tribal nations, the Navajo community, very split over what the future of mining, fossil fuels are. I make in my upcoming book, I make this argument, like a lot of people who are like native sort of environmentalists will say native people don't like fossil fuel, right? And I have one of my colleagues, who makes that argument. But I'm looking again in the Lumbee community across different other communities. It's contentious, and native communities are just as sort of split in many ways, and that split falls in line with the kind of separation and sort of dichotomous reality of the United States right now. It's hard to understand why, but I think it's because climate change is really, really pressing in on us. We see that it's getting warmer, polar ice caps are melting, hurricanes are getting bigger. At the same time as the United States, our energy situation is really odd too. When that big freeze happened in Texas, that really the energy companies were putting a lot of pressure on the United States government to fix the energy problem. But again, the energy problem is who wants their backyard to be the place where the new energy infrastructure is set up. So yeah, very contentious. I want to teach an environmental ecological sort of studies class here at USM in the next year or so, where we can begin to delve through some of those issues with the community. Because I don't think it's just students here that need to deal with it. I think community members need to come into the classroom and begin to talk through it also. So, yeah. Thank you for the context, though. Yeah. Go ahead. Oh, wait a minute. Microphone. There you go.
I'd love to hear a few words about how you think both the actual physical presence and perspective of Native folks in Maine would rationally be showing up in the labor movement if we hadn't developed as we did from a white culture and then trying to move away from that colonialism.
Wow. I think Native presence in, you said the labor movement, right?
Yeah, in Maine.
Should begin with kind of the brass tacks of society. I don't know, like, is there a big educational labor movement here in Maine? Like, is there a big teachers union?
Yeah, that's the largest union
Yeah.
in the state.
There you go. Okay. I think a big unionized organization like that should be the first to step up and say, how can we begin to think with the Wabanaki nations? It has to be a conversation. I can't define what that is. It would be like that organizational to sovereign tribal nation sort of relationship. I'm guessing at this point you have no, wait, let me back up. As my 220 students know, there is a law in Maine now where you teach Wabanaki studies, right? It passed what, 20 years ago? Still really isn't being enacted. It would be good if the teachers union would come to Wabanaki tribal nation national leaders, say, listen, I know there's a Wabanaki studies law. How can we, the union, help support you in making sure that we all learn from this curriculum, or maybe even help develop it?
Mhm.
It's those types of steps. It's not big controversial stuff. It's really saying there's already laws on the book. The Wabanaki Studies Law is one of them that you can implement quickly and then use the power of the union to implement it. Then you get into other areas of unionization, whether it's, lobster, sort of seafood sort of stuff, or whatever, the kind of blue union or whatever. Yeah. I think it's an interesting conversation, but it has that movement of Native people from invisibility to the middle of the labor movement has to be in conversation with Wabanaki Alliance, which Molly and Dana Bryant, who is they're co-sponsoring this talk. They should be at the center of that. How do we, Wabanaki Alliance, at the unions, how do we work with the tribal nations to begin to have their ideas, their traditional customs sort of, and their new knowledge based on what's going on now, come into the politics and sort of how we organize and maintain our community as whatever, teachers or whatever else. Yeah. It's a good conversation, but it's about relationship building at the end of the day. Yeah.
We have 3 minutes. One more?
Sure. I wanted to say this also. We have one medical student here, not to put you on the spot, but I was thinking healthcare in Maine is really precarious. You're talking about environmental issues where Wabanaki people have no access to clean water many times, in many cases. You have access to healthcare, which is like distraught, like a lot of Wabanaki people in particular, but I think a lot of people across Maine, no matter what community they're from, don't have access to healthcare. There is a conversation that I would love to have with people about what it means to take that labor movement into the healthcare, public health space. Don't know what it would mean, but I just feel like this lack of healthcare access to good fundamental healthcare is a union kind of labor conversation. So I'd be interested in the future to hear from people as to what they think about that. Yeah, please. Oh, okay. Yeah, please answer it now. Yeah.
Yeah, so as a federation of unions, which doesn't include the Maine Education Association, but many of the other unions in name, we have for a long time worked toward a universal coverage plan. And of course, the ease of working toward that shifts as the people in power that we have to convince shift, but that's been a long-term goal. It's a standing policy of our organization of 200 labor organizations in the state, about 40,000 workers, as well as the nurses in many of the hospitals, but not all of them, are unionized, and not as much costs, but patient care is often at the heart of what they negotiate for. So in terms of quality healthcare, in terms of access, it's we're fighting capitalism, but it is a goal of the labor movement in Maine and nationally to make it universally accessible. So.
Yeah, I lived in California for a few years. I saw the labor unions and the healthcare systems work really well, and in terms of guaranteeing pay, but also in making sure, especially it showed up during COVID, making sure that nurses, doctors, other healthcare providers within the system were protected in ways that they weren't protected in other states. So I'm wondering if there is some conversation that perhaps labor organizers in Maine can have with maybe other states where this work is going on. Not to push any agenda or whatever, but yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Feel free. Well, I thank you for, oh, yeah, please, yeah, go, yeah.
So when there are topics where it's very contentious within Native communities, how exactly can labor unions best represent a group which has such a variance in thought?
Mm. Are you thinking about like,
You had mentioned that there's a vested interest in fossil fuels for certain
oh, yeah, yeah, yeah,
tribes,
right,
so
right, right,
how
right.
do labor unions regulate
Well,
that?
that tension or that contention within Native communities oftentimes is created through colonialism itself. So basically, the whole job of the American colonial system, beginning in the United States, was to pit Native people against one another, even within their own communities. So I feel like what could be in the best interest of everybody, for the health and prosperity of every human being, is for organized labor unions to come into Native communities and begin to help address what the roots of those contestations are. Why is it that oil/energy pipelines have been pushed into Native communities where that is their primary source of capital or income or wealth, right? You see this up in the upper plains with, I think, the Crow tribe, if I'm not mistaken, Navajo definitely, and my tribe, the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina. You're definitely seeing it, even though there aren't unions around there because North Carolina isn't really a union state. But these same tensions around things like fossil fuel, dirty energy, they're everywhere in Native communities. And why is it that our communities are enduring kind of the fight over, in this case, dirty energy? So that is the bigger conversation that I think, again, within the context of organized labor unions, right? They can help address what I call the disunity that has kind of been manufactured in Native communities. There, again, big conversations.
Any last burning questions? All right.
Well, I appreciate you as an audience. I really do. Thank you for this.
Yeah, thank you so much.